So, am I responsible for racism? That's a question I want to talk about today. The recent tragedy with Ahmaud Arbery has really shaken us as a nation and shaken me personally as well. When I first saw the story, I was just scrolling through Facebook on a morning, and I saw a BBC article about how another black man had been shot. And what instantly raced through my mind was just, oh no, not again. I can't believe this is happening again. But I was also just in the middle of starting my workday, and so my immediate thought was, I don't have the mental capacity for this. So I just kept scrolling, thinking I'll just get back to it later. Throughout the day, I saw a lot more of my friends starting to post the image of Ahmaud and starting to post links to the story. And throughout the day, I just kept scrolling a little more because I kept thinking, you know what, like, I've heard this same story before. It's another tragic shooting, another tragic incident of racism, and I'll get to it later. But then I started seeing friends who typically don't post a lot, but when they do post, you know it's important and you know it's worth looking at. And so when I started seeing those friends posting about Ahmaud's story, I knew, okay, this is serious. I need to stop my day. I need to take some time and read the story. So I'm not gonna go into all the details of the story. You should take the time to read that story, and if you're able to watch the video of the actual killing. But to briefly sum it up, a black man, Ahmaud Arbery, was jogging in his neighborhood when two white men chased him down in a pickup truck and shot him and killed him because they thought he was a thief. And when we look at this, we're shocked and surprised that this could even happen. And what's really more shocking is that it took so long for these arrests to happen. 74 days. There were no arrests filed, no charges filed, and it was only recently when the video of the killing was released that everybody saw it and were outraged. And it was the pressure from the internet, really, and all the phone calls that flooded Georgia that really got the case moving and finally got these men arrested. And so the tragedy is that had this video not been released, then two men guilty of murder would have walked away free. And the reason for that is because we live in a society with systemic and structural racism. There's this quote by Will Smith in an interview where he says, "Racism is not getting worse, it's getting filmed." And the truth behind that statement is that racism has always existed, and acts of racism have always existed. Black men and women have always been unfairly treated, have been shot and killed, and their perpetrators have not been brought to justice in the US, not because they simply got away, but because no one cared to do anything about it. And the only reason that we're seeing more and more of these high-profile cases of shootings of black people are that it's actually getting filmed on camera, and it's actually being shared on social media. And so we're just shining a spotlight on something that's always been there. And the tragedy is that so many more of these have gone unnoticed. In recent years, we've had the cycle of black people being killed, and then there's protests about it, and then it kind of dies down, and then another black person is killed, and then there's more protests, and then there's this constant cycle back and forth. And a lot of America, and specifically white America, have responded negatively, saying that that it's not that big of a deal, that there's more black on black killings, that there's that black people should just obey the law. And a lot of this comes out of just an enormous amount of ignorance. So I want to put a little bit of context on this. If you remember, maybe a few years ago in 2016, Colin Kaepernick was a football player, and he started kneeling during the national anthem before football games to protest the unjust killing of black people at the hands of police. And white people across America just flipped out. They thought that it was disrespectful to the nation. They thought it was just disrespectful to military. And for the critics of these protests, they were merely inconvenienced. They just had to watch a few football players kneel for a few seconds on TV before the game started. It had no obstruction to the game whatsoever. And yet they got so angry. It doesn't matter that, there are tons of other people in the stadium who aren't actually standing for the national anthem, who are laughing, who are talking, who are buying popcorn, who are going to the bathroom. It mattered that these specific people were kneeling. And there's this argument that, these football players are being disrespectful to the military for kneeling, but the irony of that is that it was Colin Kaepernick's friend, Nate Boyer, an Army veteran, who actually suggested to Kaepernick to kneel as a sign of respect while still being able to protest. So the reality is that the white people who criticized these protests had the privilege to be inconvenienced when the people doing the protesting were actually just making a statement and pleading for their lives. So during this coronavirus quarantine, there's been a lot of protests to lift the lockdown. And a segment of those protests involved white men who armed themselves and stormed government buildings with their rifles. And the thing is, there was no police response to that. There was no tear gas. There was no riot police. There were no billy clubs. There were no arrests. These white men who carried guns and basically just forced themselves into a government building had the privilege to do so without any consequences at all. And yet in a lot of these police shootings of black people, if a black person is holding anything that resembles a gun, or if they make the slightest wrong move with their hands that makes a police officer feel threatened, they're shot dead. And yet a white man can hold a rifle and gather into a mob and storm a building, and there's nothing done to them. That is the epitome of white privilege. Black people who are protesting respectfully by kneeling during a song before a football game are called sons of bitches and treasonous, while white people who carry guns, gather into a mob, and storm a government building are called patriots. But I want to put a little bit of perspective on this as well, because white privilege is not just limited to white people. Privilege applies to any ethnicity that doesn't suffer the discrimination that's given to another ethnicity. So I share in a lot of that privilege as well. As an Asian American, when I'm driving and I get pulled over by the police officer, I don't have to worry. I don't have to fear for my life. That's a privilege that I have that a lot of black people don't have. For me and for anyone who's not of Latino heritage, we don't have to worry about being questioned about our citizenship. For me and for a lot of people, for everyone else who is not of Arab descent, we don't have to worry about being profiled at the airport. And for everyone else who's not an Asian like me, we don't have to worry about being harassed during this coronavirus quarantine. Though I never experienced any direct harassment, that was always on the top of my mind every time I went out, because of all these stories flooding in of Asian Americans both being verbally and physically assaulted because of some crazed notion that because we're Asian, we're responsible for this coronavirus. And so whether you are white or of another ethnicity, if you did not have to worry about being attacked for being responsible for unleashing the coronavirus, that's a privilege that you have. Now, as an Asian American, I've experienced my share of racism and discrimination in my life, and this isn't some kind of comparison or competition about which ethnic minority has it worse. It's just about realizing that all of us, whether we're white or of a different minority, experience a level of privilege depending on the circumstance and situation. Whenever one race suffers discrimination for a specific event, all the rest of us that don't experience that same discrimination experience the privilege of not having to go through that. And so in the events where we don't experience discrimination, that responsibility falls on us to use our privilege to be vocal for the people who are experiencing discrimination and racism. So you might be hearing this and thinking, but I'm not racist. I mean, I'm not one of the idiots who chased down a black man and killed him, and I don't, verbally assault or physically assault anybody of another race. I'm respectful of all races, so I'm not racist, and this isn't really a problem. I don't see how this applies to me. So yeah, most of us are not explicitly racist. We're not going to degrade another human being for their race, but we all have a level of implicit bias and racism, and that means we have subconscious thoughts that motivate a lot of how we see people, the things we say, and how we act. So the result of all our collective subconscious biases, all our tiny little thoughts that result in small actions, actually creates a system and a structure of racism that manifests itself in every aspect of society. And this isn't just theory. This is actually proven in a lot of research and data in which teachers and police officers and doctors actually treat black people in their professions worse than they do white patients. And this isn't done intentionally, it's just done subconsciously. So all of our subconscious bias and racist thoughts that we have that we're not even aware of manifest themselves in our daily actions that actually create an environment where extreme and explicit racism, such as the killing of this black man, can actually exist. Now, this isn't meant to be a rant or an accusation of white people or anyone else of privilege. It's just a realization that we all have privilege, whether we're white or not, in different circumstances. And having privilege is not wrong, or it's not your fault, but we have to realize that there is a responsibility that comes along with it. And so with specifically white privilege, you have to realize, if you're white, that the privilege you have came about because of a history of explicit racism and violent racism. And so the privilege that you have right now, realize that it came at a cost. And so there's a level of responsibility in owning that privilege and then using it as a tool to help right the wrongs of the past, rather than as kind of a free card for you to just sit along on the sidelines and be passive about it. If you have privilege, that means you have influence and power, and you have that responsibility to speak up on behalf of the minorities that don't have that influence and don't have that power. Racism in all its forms is perpetuated by those who have privilege and yet remain passive. Silence is a form of being complicit, and it's giving permission to those who want to be explicitly racist to carry out their actions. And so when any race experiences discrimination, we need to stand up on their behalf. And here are a few ways to do it. First, if you see a story about an act of racism, don't keep scrolling. Don't do what I did. I know it's really easy to think in your mind like, oh, I've seen the same kind of story before, or there's probably some kind of reason or justification for this, or I just don't have time for this. I'm too busy. I'll get to it later. Stop what you're doing and make time for it, because for those of us in which the act of racism wasn't done against, we have the privilege and the convenience to just keep scrolling. But those who are part of the race in which this act was done against don't have that convenience, because this shapes more of their story of life and death. So take the time to read the story. Take the time to get context on it. Take the time to read other people's perspectives and reactions to it, specifically those from the race in which an act of racism was done against. Next, develop friendships with people from other races. It's very easy to disregard situations and circumstances in which we know nothing about because we don't know anybody in that situation or circumstance. This is the equivalent of putting yourself in someone's shoes and empathizing with them. And it's a lot easier to do that when it's someone you directly know. So find a way to make friends with Black people, with Asians, with Latinos, with Arabs, with white people. Make friends with people from other races and get to understand their story, and more specifically, try to understand their life experience, how they actually experience the world day to day as a person of that race. And along with that, listen to their stories. Just listen. Don't try to think through your mind as you're listening or reading all the different excuses, the denials, the judgments, any preconceived notions that you may have, any explanations, reasons for their story. Just listen to their story and try to empathize. Try to just feel what they're feeling. If you don't have friends from other races or just are part of a community that's just not that diverse, one really good thing to do is just follow people on social media, or specifically Twitter, people who are of that race and are very vocal about anti-racism and social justice and equality. Try to read their tweets, try to get their perspectives on why they see the world the way they do, why they believe what they do. And once again, put it through a no lens, no filter type of listening, where you just understand their story without any kind of explanation or justification or judgment. And finally, when an act of racism occurs, be vocal on their behalf, defend them. If it's online, it means more than just reposting a graphic. It could be making a video response like this one. It could be writing something. It could be just resharing and amplifying minorities who are speaking in on that topic. Whatever it is, just find your own way. But be active in being vocally anti-racist. And if it happens to be in public where you are there, have the courage and make that decision ahead of time to stand up on their behalf. It's just so saddening when I hear and read about so many stories where people are in public places, whether it's at the store or on public transportation, and a minority is being harassed by somebody, and yet no one else in that it's around them does anything. Everyone just kind of sits and turns away and lets this happen. And it sucks for that person, that minority, who has to experience that kind of degradation and criticism all on their own, with all these people around them who are not being racist, but who are passively letting this act of racism happen. So whether it's online or in real life, be actively anti-racist. Being silent and being passive is only stepping aside so that people who are racist can step forward and fill that space. Being anti-racist means setting the environment and filling that space with justice. In America, we've made a lot of progress with racism. Things are so much better now than they were before, but they are nowhere near where they need to be. We've got a long road ahead. And unfortunately, the reality is that this tragedy with Ahmaud Arbery will not be the last. There will be more acts of racism, there will be more violence, and there will be more death. But it is up to us to actively work towards creating a society that is fair, that is just, that is equal, that is kind, that is compassionate. And there will always be people who are racist. There will always be a small group of people who just cannot see through their own blindness. But I don't believe they are anywhere near the majority. The responsibility of creating that just society falls on the rest of us, falls on all of us, to not let those people dictate the culture and the conversation of our country. We need to create an environment, set the tone, and fill the conversation with justice and equality so that there is no space for racism. There's this culture in America where we love saying how we're the freest country in the world and we're the greatest country in the world. But instead of focusing so much on our self-image and self-congratulating ourselves, instead of being so obsessed with being great, maybe we should start focusing on what it means to actually be good.